Senator Lloyd Bentson, there was a front page story this month in the New York Times that said despite adjustments made that the U.S. trade gap with Japan was expected to continue to grow. You head up the finance subcommittee that deals with international trade. What's your reaction to this kind of a story?
Well, I think that is correct. I think it's going to continue for a while. You see, back in about 1980, they had about a $7 billion trade surplus with us, and that's grown to this year, we anticipate about $50 billion. What you've seen is a situation where those of us that have been strong proponents of free trade have found that some of the old rules that did apply don't apply anymore, because free trade presupposes some reasonable balance in that trade. You know, to each country its competitive advantage. But if you have an enormous deficit for one and a big surplus for the other, over a continued period of time, that certainly means a drain of the wealth of one to the other. That means finally the impoverishment of one and the enrichment of the other. We have to find ways where we can break down some of these non-tariff barriers, these things that are protectionists that stop our products from coming in. How do you do it? Well, I don't think you do it by just pleading, asking. I think you have to have a tough, coordinated trade policy, and we haven't had that. You have a situation today in Washington where one day it'll be the Secretary of Defense who's intervening because he's concerned that the Department of Agriculture is being too tough on Europe and trying to meet the competition where they're putting out their subsidized agricultural products and breaking the commodity market. And he'll intervene and he'll say, you can't do that. You don't want to disturb the Europeans. I'm trying to get cruise missiles in there. I'm trying to get Pershing IIs. And the next day it's maybe the trade representative trying to get tough with Japan. And the State Department intervenes and says, you can't do that. You know, they're one of our great allies. They usually vote with us in the United Nations. And so you have everybody in charge of trade and nobody in charge of trade. And we really need a coordinated effort, not this ad hoc thing where one day we're protecting against pasta and the next day of steel and the next day heavy motorcycles. That's the sort of thing that leads to retaliation and a Smoot-Hawley approach.
Your committee has been working on the development of this trade policy throughout most of this year. Any progress?
Yes, we've been able to come up with some things where we've achieved something pretty close to consensus. I know in one of them that we had every Democrat sign up, and that's very unusual with all the divergence of views that you find. But that's one that says that the President should have as one of his primary objectives the idea that we reform GATT, and GATT, of course, is the organization, the umbrella organization, that is supposed to bring some reasonable approach overall to trade amongst nations, getting barriers down, encouraging trade, which for a long time did take place and really improved the lot of all nations. But that's not working anymore. And now GATT only affects about 5% of international trade, and even that, it's toothless because it has no means of enforcement. So one of the strong recommendations is that in this new round of trade talks, that our primary objective be reforming GATT itself, making it where it works, where it has means of enforcement. You see, we had a lot of countries that came into it that really didn't pay the price of admission because it was created about 40 years ago, and that was at a time when we were absolutely dominant in world economy. And we could afford to give away this or that economic advantage for some foreign policy objective of the moment. But that day is past. And there's some people in the State Department don't seem to realize that yet. So I think we ought to quit apologizing for self-interest. If we don't take care of ourselves, I don't know who is. And I think it's time that we get tough in trade.
The situation that you described with a good trade policy sounds like one that's depoliticized. Is that possible?
Depoliticized? I hope so. We really shouldn't be talking about a Republican economy or a Democratic economy. We ought to be talking about an American economy, and we ought to have bipartisan effort in trying to resolve some of this.
One of the things that struck me when you're talking about not apologizing for looking after our own self-interest, you hear a lot of people complaining in this country about the fact that the people that we helped after World War II have now surpassed us. What do you tell them?
I don't think we can complain about that. That's a tough competitive world out there. And I guess you could look to the alternative and say, had we not helped them, had we not done the Marshall Plan, I can think of the elections in Italy immediately following World War II, when the democratic process survived by a hair's breadth. And I don't think it would have without the United States' help. I think that was true in Greece. I'm not sure what would have happened to France if we had not helped. So what we have done, we have spawned some tough competitors. But that's all right. They're democratic countries in the main. And what we must understand is that we have to do some things ourselves. We have to do more about our educational system and upgrading that educational system. The quality of education in this country has to continue to move upward, and it hasn't. Although we're seeing some governors around the country beginning to do that, and I'm delighted. On the other hand, we have to do things in management where we do more long-term management planning and not just trying to have performance for this year to increase our bonus or to get our stock price up for the year. We have to do some research and development that may not pay off for 5 years. We have to do more of that. The Japanese are doing a pretty good job of that in realizing that long-term objectives are important and that you have to have that kind of continuity of effort. I think we have to have more of the old entrepreneurial spirit here, where management feels like it has a piece of the action and is really concerned, not just about what their salary or their perks happen to be. I think that American labor must be more quality conscious and understanding that that's what people demand today and that's what they expect. And frankly, the Japanese have taught us a thing or two in that regard. In the Congress and the President, we have to quit blaming each other for these deficits, because both sides are to blame. There's not been enough political courage shown either by the administration or the Congress. And so we have to cut that deficit back. Because look what will happen in another 3 years. You'll have a situation where if we continue at this pace, that 1/2 of your personal income tax will go to pay for interest on the debt. And that's quite a burden for all of us. We have to look at a situation on trade where 2 years ago it was around $70 billion deficit. Last year, about $123 billion trade deficit. This year, $140 to $150 billion. Well, you keep on at that rate, and another 5 years, we'd owe $1 trillion to the other nations of the world. And then you could say to Mexico and to Brazil and to Poland, move aside, fellas, you're pikers. We're the #1 debtor of the world. And whomsoever is president at that time, 5 years from now, he'd have to go hat in hand to the international bankers of the world, asking for extensions on our loans, on our credit, on our securities, on our bonds. I have no question but what he would get it. But then they would say to him, you're going to have to do the same things we told the president of Mexico, president of Brazil. Tighten your belt, lower the standard of living of the people of your country. We shouldn't wait for that. We have to move now in trying to turn those things around.
Is there a single commodity that affects our balance of trade? Of course, I'm thinking about the U.S. oil industry and dependence on...
I know you were, and I was running that one through my mind. Obviously, it's an important one, very important. But we've done a great job in conservation. That's one thing this country needs to be given some credit for. Of course, I must say we were terribly extravagant before, and we probably used oil with as much freedom as any country other than one of the countries that's a major producer today. But we have conserved, and part of it because the price went up, and people all of a sudden, when they went to bed, they went over there and they checked the flu The next morning, the first thing they did was to close that chimney. They set the thermostats lower in the winter and higher in the summer. We insisted that automobile manufacturers give us cars that weren't great gas guzzlers, and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it's been tough. But now we have cars that give us 2 and 3 times the mileage that they did before '73. Those things have happened. That's good. But oil is still a very major factor. Now, on the other side of it, where we have really been hurt is on the export of agricultural products. And that was a major, major plus for us. But we were an unreliable supplier because first you had President Nixon that curtailed the export of soybeans. And so what did Japan do? They went down and spent $1 billion in Brazil investing in soybean production. Now that's our #1 competitor. Or Jimmy Carter came along, President Carter, and put an embargo on wheat to Russia. Well, all that happened was that Argentina put more plows into grasslands and plowed that land up and increased their production. Australia did, Canada did, and took away some of our markets. Very difficult for us to recoup those markets. So that has hurt us on our trade. I think those 2 items, oil and agriculture, have been extremely meaningful. Now, you're seeing it spill over into manufacturing, and that results in a erosion of the manufacturing base of this country. And you cannot remain a great nation unless you have a diversified manufacturing base. You have to have it for national defense, if nothing else. You have to have a steel industry. You have to have an automobile industry that build the trucks and the vehicles that are necessary to protect your country. And those people that say, well, don't worry about it. We're becoming a service-oriented society. Look at how many jobs we've created. I know this administration says they've created 7 million in the first 4 years, and I think that's a fair figure. Sometimes they forget that the previous administration created 10 million in the 4 years. And those service jobs are important. But if you read the Bank of England's last quarterly report, they state that one of their mistakes was depending too much on the service industry, because it does not create the wealth within the country by bringing in wealth from other countries to the extent that the export of manufacturing does. In other words, you can't do it just by taking in other people's washing. You have to be able to manufacture products that you sell abroad, and you're paid for those products, and they help you in your balance of payment.
You mentioned in our opening comments about the impact of the deficit in the trade picture. Let's talk about the deficit for a bit. First of all, what does the average American citizen in December of 1985, what impact would they feel of our large deficit on their lives?
Large deficit on trade?
No, on the lives of the average American at this point.
By the trade deficit?
No, our budget deficit.
Budget deficit. Yes. Not much. It hasn't caught up with us yet. We find the average American is saving less than he has, or she has ever saved. And we have a great propensity for consumption in this country. So they've been spending it to an extraordinary amount. I'm reminded of the T-shirt I saw the other day that said, how can I be broke? I still have checks. Well, a lot of people have acted that way. But Monday morning comes around if you have that kind of a weekend binge, and you have to pay for it. And that day is approaching us. And when you reach that day, when other countries begin to lose confidence in our ability to monitor our own resources, to do a reasonable job in our expenditures, then you'll see a withdrawal of capital from this country. And when that happens, then you have to have interest rates go up to try to retain it, and you got yourself lots of problems. And in effect, this debt, if it continues to mount, as it has been, that means that it won't be too many more years before you will see a lot more taxes to try to service that debt. And it means that you're mortgaging the future, that it's not just your children that are going to pay for it. assuming you're going to be around a reasonable number of years, you're going to pay for it. So it's really dumb not to face up to that responsibility now.
Syndicated columnist Tom Wicker said the basic question facing us about the deficit, the budget deficit today, is what price are Americans willing to pay for deficit reduction? Do you know the answer to that?
We're going to find out. I think you're going to see most Americans, 51% majority, that understand, willing to pay the price. I think we have no alternative. But it also means that the political leaders of the country must be able to get that message across, that they have to face up to that responsibility and communicate it better than they have in the past. Polls in the past showed that budget deficits really didn't concern people. I think more and more that they are concerned. That they're troubled about what the future holds from an economic standpoint. And I think they're beginning to look more and more at how that fellow up in Washington votes. Is he measuring up to the responsibility? Is he casting some of those tough votes to say, gee, I wish we could do that for you, but we just can't afford it?
What is your feeling about the Gramm-Rudman direction that the Congress has been taking?
I have voted for it, support it, I guess more out of frustration than anything else. I don't particularly like the mechanics of it. But I support it in the hope that, that it is tough enough where we'll do what we should do in the beginning, and that's pick and choose as to where the taxpayer is getting most for his dollar and where he needs it the most, and that the president will do the same thing. So with that in mind, I support it. But I must say that in the spring, I voted a Democratic measure that brought about a balanced budget by 1990. We lost that one. But that would have been 70% in cuts in appropriations. But it would have been 30% in restoration of taxes. And the president, of course, is adamant against that part of it. I think finally that's what you have to do. I don't like that, but I don't see any other choice, ultimately, if we're going to continue to keep a strong defense, and if we're going to keep some of those programs that I think are absolutely necessary. I look at things like, talk about the FBI and anti-terrorism. I think that's important. I think we have to have a CIA and an intelligence system to tell us what's going on around that world. It's a tough world we face. I think we have to build the highways. I think we have to build the sewage systems. I think you need things like prenatal health care, because you look at a situation where so many children are having children. Tragedy. And so many of them in low income are giving birth to handicapped children. And all our studies show that with some prenatal health care, those children might be born well and whole and be able to lead a productive life. In fact, the payoff is $3.38 to $1, according to the estimates. So if you're the toughest of conservatives, that's a pretty good investment in the future of your country. And I happen to be one of those fellows that comes from a business background. There are not a lot of us in the Senate, but I built a business, understand that, and feel that when you invest the taxpayers' money, you ought to get a good return for it.
Henry Cisneros is from your own state. He is a mayor who has just assumed the chairmanship of the National League of Cities. They met this month, and their feeling was that the Gramm-Rudman approach would be devastating for the cities.
Well, I don't really think that. I think it means the cities have to measure up to more of raising the funds for what they do. The people have to pay for the services they receive, and they have to judge that. And they have to judge it in those instances at the local level. That's not all bad. Somehow they seem to think it's not as painful if it's done by Washington. But that's the same folks involved, same taxpayers pay for it. It gets localized more at the city level. So when you're running these incredible deficits, I think it's important that we get as much of it back to the local level as we can.
Is a tax increase inevitable?
I think we're going to get one. It's just a question of when. I strongly feel that we should first cut everything we can reasonably cut. And when we feel we've finally reached that point, that the 25% tax cut that we made, that part of it will be restored, part of it.
President Reagan has been pledging since he was first elected to office that there would not be a tax increase. Do you feel that that it's going to happen during his rest of his tenure in office?
Well, I think so. I think if Gramm-Rudman passes in its present form, that you're going to see a tax increase, and it'll be in the president's remaining part of his term.
The other element in terms
and
of...
I think it'll be one of those things that he reluctantly accepts.
The other element of taxes, of course, is tax reform in this country. Is it something that it's necessary, especially looking at your own business background? Was it time for tax reform in the United States?
The word reform has a certain pleasant connotations normally. It's something better than what you have. But you have to remember that the 81 was a reform of the previous tax bill, and that was a reform of the previous tax bill, and so it goes. I think that you ought to continue always to work on the tax legislation to be sure that some of the incentives you put in the system are still necessary. Some of them, for various changes in the economy, play out, and they end up being something that doesn't truly help the overall economy. But you take a look at the things that are in the system. You've got an incentive in there to encourage people to contribute to charity, whether it's their church, an educational system, Salvation Army, whatever. I think that's right. I think it ought to be there. You have an incentive in there to say, let's not destroy some of the historic buildings we have, if we can have an incentive and encouragement for the private sector to do it. I think that's good. You say, I think we ought to buy the equipment to modernize the productive capacity of the country, the manufacturing capacity, so we can be more competitive with these other fellows that are beginning to beat us at our own game. I think that's justified. But then you look at them and you see some of these things and you say, well, we've become too generous there. And decisions are being made by business people, not for economic reasons, but for tax reasons. And therefore, we have to cut that one back. So it ought to evolve. Each of these things in the system has been put there and argued for and finally convinced a majority in this body and in the other body and the president. So you've had hearings and folks from around the country have been in here to testify, open hearings and that sort of thing. But a massive, massive reform, and that's what you're talking about now. What you don't see in much of the discussion is the fact that you're going to have very substantial economic dislocations that take place over quite a number of years. And some of the people will not sustain them. They will be thrown into bankruptcy. And most of these studies that you see of these econometric models and the economists presuppose that you get from here to there painlessly and overnight. And it just doesn't happen that way. So you have to build in transitional periods and that type of thing. So there's the degree of change. I think there's a serious question about that. All of us would like a lower tax bracket. All of us would like it down as low as possible. But this is one that is called revenue neutral. So it means that you just shift it over to somebody else in the process. So it is a situation where we've had 50 days of hearings over that in this body, and we have the question of bringing it up next year in the Senate, and it'll get massaged, and changes, revolutionary changes, sometimes pretty hard to justify.
Given the nature of Congress, were it possible to enact revolutionary across-the-board reforms of the tax code, would we not find ourselves in a situation where Congress would immediately begin tinkering with any plan that we had, so we'd eventually end up in the same situation we are now?
It'd take quite a while, I would think. The one thing that we do have to have, and there's just no question in my mind about that, and I'm one of the authors of such a plan, is to see that we have a minimum tax that makes certain that these corporations that have been making hundreds of millions of dollars worth of income over a sustained period of years and paying no taxes, that we put an end to that. That is, you just can't justify a thing like that. You take a fellow that's making $25,000 a year, family of 4, and he gets his tax bill, and then he reads that this enormous corporation has made hundreds of millions of dollars over 5 or 6 years and paid 0 taxes. It's not just one, it's several of those. He says, you know, that's not right. There's something wrong with the system, and he is right. And that we have to stop. And I have a piece of legislation in, but others do too, that will put a stop to that. And that we have to do. And I'm convinced that will be done. Same thing is true of individuals. If you have individuals that have found some way to beat the system, that they have pulled together a bunch of these tax incentives to a point where finally they pay no taxes, you can't allow that. That's just not right. And I think we will definitely correct that one. I must say that we've gone a long way to already correct that for the individuals. Today you have very, very few that don't pay any taxes. And they make headlines when they do, and then we get to digging into it. And how did he get away with that? You know, how can we stop that? And you'll find in most instances, as we've checked on those, that the fellow's had an enormous casualty loss of some kind. A home is burned down, or his business has been flooded, or that person is a foreigner living in this country who's paying substantial taxes in another country and gets credit for it in this country. And between sovereign nations, you have that kind of an agreement. You know, if the fellow's paying back in his own country, you don't hit him twice. So he gets the credit. But in our own system, then all of a sudden, it shows you're not paying taxes. So many of those you see in those stories, once you get into them, there's really a sound reason for it happening. But the few that don't, we've got to get them.
At this time of year, it's customary not only to review the year behind you, but to look ahead to the coming year. What would you like to see come out of the Finance Committee in 1986?
I'd like to see a coordinated trade policy, and one that tries to knock down these protective barriers, that leads to some reciprocation if they don't, put some muscle into the situation. I would like to see that pass, and I'd like to see the President's support of that. I'd like to see the President put one person in charge of trade. And then I would like to see us do the minimum tax on corporations to be sure that if they don't pay the regular tax, that we at least catch them with a minimum tax, and that we don't have a situation where someone is making a lot of money and not paying anything. I want to see that also done for the individuals. I think we ought to also, because we get involved in Medicare and Medicaid in our committee, I think we should do some things in trying to see that we cut back on the cost of medical care and hospital care by things like saying on hospice, where someone has a terminal illness, that they don't have to stay in an institution, a medical institution, with the enormous costs that are involved there, but that we ought to let them get some medical attention at their home with their loved ones, and that cuts the costs way down. I think we ought to have something that says that when you have a catastrophic illness, that you don't have to have a financial disaster and get wiped out in the process. And I have some legislation in that would correct that. It would be a situation where it'd be a very modest cost of about $3 or $4 a month to add that kind of a supplemental benefit to something like Medicare. I think that's important.
1986 is also an election year. We just have a couple of seconds left with you. Prospects for Democrats gaining control of the Senate?
Well, we have to gain 4 seats, and it's going to be a squeaker either way.
Looking forward to it?
You bet. I think that it's going to be fun. I look at some of those fellows that have become chairman of those committees. I hear some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, "Oh, those radicals will take over the Senate committees." Baloney. You take fellows like Sam Nunn at head Armed Services. He's a very knowledgeable, able man. You'd have fellows like Childs at head of Budget. He's certainly a very responsible senator. Bennett Johnston would head up Energy. Let's see. Well, modesty almost prevents me from saying, but I guess it won't, who would head up Finance Committee. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Senator Bentson, thank you for your time. Appreciate your overview of 85 and a look ahead to 86.
Thank you.